Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the 2016 World Chess Championship. We're in Game 3. Games 1 and 2 were super uneventful. 2 draws. Magnus Carlsen in Game 1 playing the rather interesting pawn to d4, Trompowsky opening. Not a common opening for him. And then Sergei Karjakin in Game 2 just playing an uneventful Rai Lopez game. So in Game 3, expecting something a little bit different for Magnus Carlsen since we only have 10 more games, all the preparation going into it. I expect something really nice for Magnus Carlsen. And he starts out with pawn to e4, so much more common to see from Magnus Carlsen, a little bit more aggressive pawn to e4. Pawn to e5 from Sergei Karjakin, knight to f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, so getting into the Rai Lopez, and then knight to f6. And this is the Berlin defense. It's what we were even expecting Magnus Carlsen to play in Game 2, but we did not see that. Played more of the Morphy defense with pawn to a6. But Magnus Carlsen, very, very familiar with this, playing as the black pieces. So he obviously knows exactly what to do for the white pieces. This is a very theoretical opening, so I expect a lot of preparation from both sides that really go into this particular game. So interesting to see how both sides attack this. Magnus Carlsen castling on the king side, probably the more common way that we see defense against this. Knight takes on e4. So getting into the open variation, could always go for more of a classical variation with bishop to c5. I really like to attack it this way, but knight to e4 is pretty common nowadays. Rook to e1, attacking, knight comes back here to d6, and then the knight taking on e5. Now, bishop to e7 is fairly interesting. You know, he does have some options here, but decides to go ahead and bishop to e7 so he can castle on the king side, and then bishop back here to f1. Could always try something with pawn to a4 if he wants to hold on to that. Would be giving up his bishop pair. Decides not to go ahead and do that, so brings his bishop back down here to f1. Knight takes on e5, and then rook recaptures here on e5, and then castle on the king side. Magnus Carlsen continues with pawn to d4, bishop to f6, and then we see a pretty interesting move from Magnus Carlsen. Pretty sure everyone in the room had no clue what was going on. Magnus Carlsen played rook here to e2. Now, this is a move that generally, if you look at, you're playing someone, just your average player, it looks like a mistake. I would view it as a mistake, generally speaking. If Magnus Carlsen makes this move, he doesn't really make a ton of mistakes. He's definitely not making a mistake on move number 10 in the Berlin defense. It just doesn't happen. So Sergei Karjakin spent about 25 minutes looking at this position, trying to figure out why Magnus Carlsen, instead of just coming back here to e1, would bring it back here to e2. It's blocking off his light square bishop from getting involved into the game. It's not really doing anything except defending this second row, but that doesn't really help too much. It is blocking his queen if his queen was going to get involved, typically just protecting the center of the board. It doesn't really seem like it's doing too much. Now, Sergei Karjakin, he doesn't have too many options as far as how he's going to respond to this. Specifically, he could play pawn to b6 if he wanted to. He could instead just bring his rook over here to e8 that says, I'm not sure what your rook's doing, but I'll go ahead and trade off if you really want to. But he took a long time with that, and he played pawn to b6 at the end of it. It was interesting after the game. They have a press conference. They ask both of these players about different positions, different moves. And at one point, Magnus Carlsen kind of joked around, and he kind of looked at Karjakin, and he's like, "What do you think of the rook slip on move 10?" And kind of got a chuckle from the crowd. Obviously, not a slip by any means. It was very, very much intended for Magnus Carlsen. But if anything, I don't know that this is necessarily the best move for Magnus Carlsen. But psychologically, it kind of psyched his opponent out. He really didn't know what to do. He thought maybe Magnus was on a completely different level playing these moves that he just hadn't prepared for. And to get 25 minutes off of your opponent's time bank is always a good thing. Now, Magnus Carlsen then played rook to e1, and I'm sure Karjakin was like, okay, why did I just waste 25 minutes? Because you almost just wasted a move bringing back here to e1. But all in all, pretty entertaining to see that turn of events with Karjakin kind of racking his brain there. Now, rook to e8 says, let's go ahead and just get rid of these rooks if we want to. I don't know exactly what you're up to. Bishop here to f4, and then a rook takes down here on e1, and then the queen retakes on e1. Karjakin now plays queen to e7. Now, if you kind of look at it and say, well, the queen was protecting the pawn, why doesn't he just take bishop takes on d4? It gets pretty tricky. So after the bishop takes here, then all of a sudden bishop to d6, and then it depends on how Karjakin wants to respond. If he wants to go and take this pawn right here, then all of a sudden queen to e4, attacking both the rook and this bishop right here. If he wants to take down here on b2, gobble up this rook, all of a sudden the queen can come up here, a8, bishop down here, a1, bishop to a6, and then at the end of the day, black is going to go down in material. Can't really move his bishop here or the queen falls, and so he is just going to end up losing material right here. Magnus Carlsen has 2 minor pieces to 1. It's going to be a pretty easy in-game from here. If he decides not to retake, if we come back here and say, let's just go ahead and play bishop to b2. Then all of a sudden, bishop to c7, attacking the queen. Queen over here to f8. Knight to d2. After the bishop takes, queen takes here. But then all of a sudden, you see 3 minor pieces. That's more than material to make up for since he didn't recapture that bishop here on d6. So all in all, this is going to be pretty bad. And Sergei Karjakin decides correctly not to go ahead and take that bishop or that pawn here on d4. And say he decides to play queen to e7. Says, hey, we'll go ahead and trade off material if you want to. Knight to c3, just continuing to develop from Magnus Carlsen. Bishop to b7. I find he might have even played bishop to b7 before queen to e7. He did play this pawn to b6 for a very specific reason. That's to play bishop to b7. So even expected this one move before. Not too bad, though. Queen takes on e7. Recapture, and then pawn to a4. So Magnus Carlsen starting to push a little bit on the queen side. a6, just securing the b5 square for the knight. Always come here for a nice little outpost, starting to attack the c7 square, which can be very dangerous, attacking the rook here if it actually were to get there. G3, covering the square here on h4 in case the bishop were to come down. Pawn here, g5. So Karjakin starts to get a little bit aggressive, getting his pawns involved into the game on the king side. Once your opponent's queen come off the board, you can be a little bit more aggressive with your pawns. You don't have to have full protection with your pawns in front of your king. So that's kind of what he's going after. Bishop takes on d6, and the bishop recaptures. And you may look at it and say, well, there's double bishop pawns. But Magnus Carlsen knows that he can go ahead and play bishop to g2. And it's no longer going to have double bishop pair because the bishop almost has to take. He doesn't want to lose his rook here. So bishop takes, king takes here on g2, pawn here to f5, and then up here to d5. So wants to be pretty active with his knight. He knows his opponent's bishop can control a lot of the board. So he wants to make sure his knight's in the center of the board, which allows them to cover more ground than if the knight was on just one side of the board. Karjakin, king to f7. Now we're going to start to get the kings involved into the game. Knight here to e3, just starting to attack some of the pawns. And then king to f6, protecting the pawn. Knight to c4, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes back here to f8. And the bishop probably is a little bit stronger in the end games. Once there's bishops on all sides of the board, the bishop can just control more of the board. But you'll see Magnus Carlsen doing a really good job with his knight to put a lot of pressure and just try to control as many of the pawn structures as possible. Rook over here to e1. What's nice too, this rook controlling this long open file, you can't just bring the rook over here to e8, which Karjakin would like to, because there's no way to defend both this pawn structure right here and also have material to recapture here on e8. Now, he played rook over here to d8. I think another move potentially could have looked at was pawn to d5, just trying to control the center of the board. Maybe knight to e5, bishop to d6, really trying to blow up the center of the board. Now he can even play rook over here to e8 if he wanted to, but decided instead to go and play rook to d8, and then maybe push forward with d5 a little bit later. Pawn to f4, so Magnus Carlsen looking to blow up the king side structure. Pawn takes, pawn recaptures, pawn here to b5. After the recapture, then knight back here to e3, attacking the pawn here on f5. Pawn c6, so solid pawn change. So if you kind of look at this, it feels somewhat drawish. Not necessarily it's a kind of a game like 1 and 2, which it didn't even seem like both sides weren't even trying except for to get a draw as fast as possible. But it would be very difficult in this position to find a win. There's just not tons of material. It's since all the pawns are kind of on the same files, they can easily just get locked up. Like I could play pawn to h5 and h4 very easily. And then it's just kind of a song and dance, both sides trying to get their rooks behind enemy lines. But at the end of the day, top level play, this looks somewhat draws. Now, the good thing for Magnus Carlsen is he just likes to make some games go extremely long because he wants to wear down his opponent. As far as stamina, he has that. No one's better at the end game in the entire world than Magnus Carlsen. If there's ever an advantage, he can find it. He usually finds it and he converts that. So this is kind of right up his alley. He understands the pawn structure in the birdland defense better than anyone. So at no point, like some of the other games where I was like, all right, okay, they're about to get to move 30 and draw, I expect the Magnus Carlsen to try to take this as long as possible. So we continue. He plays king to f3, starting to get his king involved into the game. Rook to a8, rook to g1, and then rook to a2. And I thought this was a really good play from Sergei Karjakin. I know a lot of people looked at this, and if you kind of looked at the meter, depending on where you're watching this, this showed a slight advantage for Magnus Carlsen after the rook down here to a2. Magnus Carlsen responds with pawn to b3. But if you kind of look at it from Karjakin's standpoint, he's trying to be aggressive. He's pretty much in a defensive situation. Plays rook over here to a8. Plays rook down here to a2. I mean, besides rook to a2, where is he going to go? Bishop to h6, potentially. Putting some pressure on this pawn on f4 maybe. But I even like rook to a2. I probably would have done the same move. I love the fact that he's trying to be as aggressive as possible and getting your rook down to the second rank. I usually recommend that myself. So I don't think that's necessarily bad. But Magnus Carlsen, he finds these very, very small places where he can find an advantage. But plays pawn to b3, c5, recognizing that, okay, this pawn right here is what the rook's attacking. This knight here on e3 is defending it. So he would like to just play his bishop down here, pin down the knight to the rook. Can't really defend the square anymore. But first he needs to blow up this pawn. So if he could play pawn to c5, kind of blow up this pawn right here. Ideally, it'd be pawn captures, bishop recaptures. This is very good for Sergei Karjakin. Magnus Carlsen, he's not really going to let that happen. Says, hey, that bishop you really want to get involved into the game. I'm going to go and play rook here to g8. I'm going to put you to the test here. So king to f7. Now rook back here to g2. But now after the pawn takes, knight up here to f5 and attacking this pawn here on d4. And now it's kind of a tough spot because the king came up here to f7, no longer was protecting the pawn here on f5. So this allows kind of a tough spot for Sergei Karjakin because he's going to end up losing material on board. So he plays pawn to a d3, pawn up here to d3, and then a rook down here to a1. So Magnus Carlsen in that exchange goes up a pawn of material, and you start to get a sense from Magnus Carlsen that if there was ever a spot where he could take a position and turn it into a win, it's definitely going to be this spot right here. Carlsen now plays knight to d4, pawn to b4, rook up here to g5. So his knight on d4 is protecting this pawn here on b3. Now he decides to go as getting rook involved into the game behind enemy line and start to really put pressure on his opponent. Rook here to b1, that pawn's being protected, that's fine. Rook to f5 check, king here to e8. Rook over here, b5, attacking this pawn. The pawn is being protected by this bishop here on f8, so that is a good thing. Rook here to f1, king to e4, rook to e1, and then king up here to f5. But we kind of look at this, Magnus Carlsen doing a good job of defending, but he's also just slightly improving his position with every move. He has his rook in a very active position. His knight's in the center of the board, which is exactly where you want it. His king is very involved into the game. He's up a pawn. He has a pass pawn here on the f-file. He has a huge advantage right now as we are in the end game. Sergei Karjakin definitely in a tough spot. If there's anyone that can take a winning end game, turn it into win, it's definitely Magnus Carlsen, as we have talked about before. So it's all about execution from here. Rook here to d1, rook over here to e5, check, king to f7. Rook to d5 says, hey, you can go ahead and take my pawn. I'll take your pawn as well. As we kind of chip away down to the end game, we can exchange material. That's going to be fine with me. Rook takes here, check. king up here to e8, rook back here to d4. Still just protecting the knight right here, so that's good. Rook here to h3, rook e5 check, and then after the king moves, then rook down here to e2, doing a nice job of protecting that material here on h2. A bishop to g7, attacking the knight, knight to c6, attacking the pawn here on b4. First h5 from the rook check, and then rook over here to c5, attacking the knight right here. Knight up here to d8 check, king moves to g6, knight to e6, pawn down here to h5. And if we come back just a few moves and we look at it, you may say, why on move 48? Why did he not just take the material on b3? So if he were to take this material here on b3, then all of a sudden knight to d8, this is very, very tricky. The king can't move to e6, f6, g6 because the king kind of in a tough spot. So if it comes back, rook up here to e8, bishop to f8, and then knight here to e6, that bishop's going to fall. Minor piece and a major piece against just your opponent's major piece, definitely going to be a victory for Magnus Carlsen there. So did want to make sure that we covered that because some people may have asked about that question. But rook here to h5, and then decides to go ahead and swing it over here. Knight here to d8 check, but now the king can come here to g6 since the king is not on f5. Knight to e6, pawn down here to h5. King to f3, rook here to c3, king up here to h4 or e4, bishop f6, and then a rook here to e3. Now you may look at it and say, why doesn't he just take material on board? He's going to play pawn to h4, pawn to h3. At some point, though, you would imagine that it's going to be better for one of these sides to actually trade off their rooks here. But if we kind of look at it, it all depends on the exact position. So if black were to take material right here, okay, this gets pretty tricky. The king can take, and then all of a sudden, king to f5, knight up here to c7. The king is still centralized, protecting this pawn. That's very important that the king is protecting this pawn right here. Then this knight can kind of just move around and put a lot of pressure on his opponent and start to gobble up material since he does have a pawn advantage right here. Now, if we kind of look at this and say, instead of h3 here, why doesn't he just go ahead and take material? Okay, well, if he takes on here, then all of a sudden the pawn recaptures. This is a pass pawn, and if he wants to stop this, he's going to have to move his king away from that protected pawn, and this is kind of a dangerous spot because then you just have the king come here to f5, attacking the knight, and then if the knight moves, then this pawn is going to fall. Just no longer has kind of that advantage on board. So while it looks like one of these sides is really going to want to exchange rooks off the board, unfortunately in this position, that's just not what they want to do. So rook up here to e3, pawn to h4, and then pawn to h3. Play continues. Karjakin plays rook here to c1, and then knight up here to f8, check, king to f7, knight to d7, attacking the bishop. King here to e6 says, hey, you can exchange material on board. Your knight's pretty valuable, so I'll exchange. Decides not to. Knight over here to b6, rook here to d1, pawn up here to f5, just increasing his advantage a little bit more. King to f7, knight down here to c5. It's a nice little outpost. It's not doing a whole lot, but always a nice outpost. That rook up here to a d4, king over here to f3, bishop down here to g5, attacking the rook, rook here to e4. Another one of those positions. It'd be great if Karjakin decided to go and exchange right here. He could take with his king, just have a pass pawn that he could start pushing up the board. Besides, that's not going to be good for him. Rook here to d3, king to g4, and then rook over here to g3. Now, this is a pretty good square. It's an outpost attacking your opponent, but unfortunately, I think this is exactly what Magnus Carlsen wants on board because he just wants to play king here to h5, and then you can't take the pawn here because then you just take your bishop. Well, that's clearly bad. Instead of the rook coming here, could have maybe tried something around bishop to f6, kind of take it away from the king to take here. Maybe rook up here to e6, and then you play rook to g3. This makes a lot of sense to me. But in the game, rook here to g3, king up here h5, and now the bishop comes back to e7. I think it's a little bit too late. Knight here to e5, check. King to f6, knight to g4, putting more pressure on his opponent, and then a rook up here e6. Rook takes on h3. Definitely think that is a mistake. Knight up here to e5, check after the king moves. Then all of a sudden, the rook takes here on e7. Magnus Carlsen continues to build his advantage. He does have an entire minor piece up on his opponent. So now it's just a matter of execution from here. King to f6, knight to c6. Decides to go ahead and take this material on board. Didn't really like the fact that he gave up material, but did decide to go ahead and do that. Knight to a5. Very, very odd move, I think, on board. To get your knight over on this one side of the board, I think it takes away from being active on board. I don't think that's exactly what he wants to do. I think that's a huge mistake. Starts to allow his opponent to get back into it a little bit. Rook to h1. And then kind of the questionable move in not only the game, but the tournament so far. He played rook over here to b7. Huge mistake. He really needed to continue to be aggressive. Rook here to f7, check after the king moves, then come down to f2. He needs to actually, he should be more concerned about this second rank. This pass pawn from his opponent's really the only thing he has to worry about. This knight over here is going to take care of his own business. Black can't just give up this pawn right here because then he'll lose this pawn structure over here. But instead, Magnus Carlsen focuses on this pawn over here and forgets about this pass pawn. Huge mistake. So after the rook comes over here to b7, rook over here to a1, attacking the knight. Now rook down here, b5 check, defending the knight as well. But then this king says, hey, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and start attacking over here. And something's going to have to give. You're no longer going to have your massive advantage that you had. So rook takes on b4. Again, Sergei Karjakin does not care at all. King here to g3. Rook over here to g4. Doesn't matter at all. King here to f2. Knight c4. Pawn to h3. And Magnus Carlsen can get a sense that, hey, I may have messed up a little bit. Now I'm going to have to put all my focus over here on this passed pawn. Rook over here to h4. King to g3. Rook here to g4, and you see after this particular move that Magnus Carlsen recognizes that he's not going to be able to have the advantage. In this particular spot, they decided to draw the game. So afterwards, it was pretty tough to watch Magnus Carlsen at the press conference just because he knew he gave up a win on board. He seemed like he was going to be pretty bummed when he saw the computer and saw the big errors that he made, especially at the end, knowing that he played so well in the end game. Took this out. It was a very long game, many hours. Exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to just wear his opponent down, and then he got to a position and was not able to capitalize. So after 3 games, we have by far our most exciting game. Both sides really went for it. Magnus Carlsen played phenomenally. I thought Sergei Karjakin defended extremely well. I just think this was Magnus Carlsen kind of at the height of his excellence, but at the very end, I'm not sure if he just got tired or just missed a position, but did miss a win in this end game. So all in all, we have 3 draws. We come back tomorrow. Sergei Karjakin playing the white pieces. He will kind of chalk this up as almost a victory with a win, a draw as the black pieces, knowing that he could have lost. So he's going to try to take that momentum and turn that into a win tomorrow. So hopefully you guys enjoyed a more exciting game 3 and look for more in the future. But everyone, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys tomorrow.